insurance companies start bringing claims, because of course they're going to suffer financial losses due to climate change. So I think that's going to happen. The other thing that is already happening is lawsuits against major companies. Many of them are energy companies of various sorts, claiming that they have tried to purposefully squelch the evidence. So it's the same sort of evidence of climate change. So it's the same sort of litigation strategy that happened against the tobacco companies. And if you remember, that was successful. And so there have been a number of state attorneys general who have filed lawsuits. And so you might remember that eventually the courts held that the tobacco companies did indeed mislead people and so forth, and then we eventually got the tobacco settlement out of that and so forth. So I think we'll see some more of that. And so one of the things that raises for you is what will you do? I mean, for example, do you want your organization in the Tampa Bay area to join in? On behalf of young people in the Tampa Bay area who are going to be adversely affected by climate change. Perhaps you want to join in on these atmospheric trust litigation lawsuits. Even if you aren't going to win, there ends up being a certain amount of sort of symbolic or publicity value for doing that. And so sometimes that's exactly why public interest groups do that. Brings attention to the issue and so forth. And then also, is there a possibility of other kinds of common law actions, perhaps maybe in combination? So for example, something that might be a local environmental phenomenon in land use that's local, that by itself maybe is not going to cause enough harm to constitute a nuisance, but when considered in the context of climate change. So for example, certain sorts of industrial facilities or pollution emitting facilities, while those might not be considered nuisances by themselves, maybe the risk of harm rises greatly with climate change and so forth. So that's something to consider. So another issue here has to do with federal government cooperating with localities and other stakeholders to manage estuaries. So the Tampa Bay is an estuary. Estuary is a body of water where the salt water from the ocean and the fresh water from the inland waterways mix. They mix. And so that's a type of wetland that's incredibly important. And so can we manage those for climate? So more generally, what can be done about climate change? One is to look at what kind of infrastructure, and can we move from totally gray infrastructure, the sort of paved, human-created stuff, to green infrastructure or mixed infrastructure. We're going to talk about that today, but in general, green infrastructure is more adaptive and resilient to climate change than the gray infrastructure, although what we generally find is that we can't actually create enough green to do everything, so often mixed is the preferred alternative. Okay? Insurance systems, can we develop insurance systems that have the right incentives? Right now, our National Flood Insurance Program has what we call perverse incentives because it actually incentivizes building in flood-prone areas. Okay? So what one expert has said about the National Flood Insurance Program is it is a federally funded insurance program that is just as if the federal government decided to insure automobile drivers and they insured only teenage boys who drink and drive. Right, so they write the worst risk possible, and that's exactly what we do with the flood insurance program. Adaptive management, we've talked about adaptive management before, but we need more adaptive management of coastal resources because they're going to be changing. We talked about shifting sands and changing coastlines and so forth. And so, reminder, adaptive management means experimental, flexible, and adaptive, but it necessarily requires feedback loops, the learning part, and that's often the part that's missing. So if we were kind of thinking about this as a strategy, we would want to emphasize the importance of built-in feedback loops. And then legal developments to upset the status quo. So, for example, atmospheric trust litigation, maybe one of the best things that it can do is just upset the status quo, cause the parties to move beyond just sort of the acceptance of the status quo. And so that was, remember, Mono Lake was exactly that kind of case. Place-based solutions, public engagement education, politics, and collaborative problem solving. This is just a reiteration of the non-legal aspects from the Mono Lake case study, where we, basically, if you are relying solely on law, it's often not going to be adequate. So the sorts of things that get the public, the political leaders, governance leaders, holders of resources, and multiple stakeholders involved in solving the problem. So we have some mitigation strategies that we can have sort of traditional command and control regulation that limits greenhouse gas emissions, that restricts emitters from putting more greenhouse gas emissions in the air. Another alternative is carbon tax. A carbon tax that basically just taxes carbon emissions or carbon usage. Emissions trading system, so this is like cap and trade and so forth, where it is just a carbon or greenhouse gas version of the pollution credit trading that we discussed earlier, right? Same idea, same principle. And then subsidies for basically paying for emitters of greenhouse gases to reduce their emissions. So these are all the sorts of things that are aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Your organization probably cares about that a fair amount, right? So think about low-income neighborhoods of color who are going to be harmed by climate change. They probably want, cars to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. They want power plants to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, that kind of thing. But also think about the fact that all of those emissions are coming from lots and lots of different sources. How much time, energy, financial resources of your organization are you going to put into it? That's a little bit of a tricky issue. As we've talked about before with environmental justice, there are networks of grassroots groups, and so maybe your best collective action approach is to join with other networks as opposed to taking, join with other organizations in your network as opposed to taking it on individually yourselves. Reducing emissions for particular sectors, power, electricity, industry, buildings, and transport. Okay, that's just pretty, that's all kind of obvious stuff. The idea of, maybe instead of just focusing on carbon sources, like fossil fuels, we also want to think about carbon sinks that absorb carbon and trying to devote more attention to that. That ties into what we're going to talk about today in terms of green and blue infrastructure. And so there's a international approach called REDD, so reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, that it aims at providing incentives to developing countries that have forests to maintain their forests as opposed to cutting them down, and so forth. Basically, wealth transfers to create incentives. That's been somewhat mixed. That actually on a owner by owner or timber company by timber company basis has not been very successful, but when you actually focus it more on the nation, it's been more successful on a nation by nation basis. So, and then adaptation. We've talked a lot about adaptation as a response in addition to mitigation. And then also, what about compensation for loss or damage that occurs? What mechanisms do we have in place? And that circles back to insurance. I mean, so you know, if there are losses, financial losses due to climate change, you know, sort of the you know, less desirable time to sort of figure out where the resources to compensate the communities that have been adversely affected is after it's happened. It's more effective to plan ahead more strategically and think about, you know, could there be some sort of compensation system built into place ahead of time that would provide resources. Of course, the danger, right? You see this with the state pensions and other sorts of things. The danger is anytime you have a fund that isn't currently being spent, public officials see it as a target to spend that money on other things that are more immediate, right? And so there's a political problem there. So just some pictures of that. So what about some EJ strategies related to climate change and climate justice? By the way, these are folks who are actually in the Tampa Bay area who are working on climate change and climate justice and environmental justice issues. So I tried to actually get a real picture of real people doing that. So obviously, one thing is to focus on community resilience, right, to a whole variety of different disturbances that are caused by climate change, everything from urban heat to water pollution to flooding to storm surge and hurricanes and disasters and so forth. These are a couple of maps in the Tampa Bay area, one focusing on urban heat, and you can see certain urban heat islands concentrated in areas, and they tend to be more correlated to lower income neighborhoods and minority neighborhoods, and likewise tree canopy cover, and again, lower tree canopy cover, more tree canopy loss in lower income and minority neighborhoods. And you have some data on that in some of the readings, right? So a variety of problems and resilience and justice. So, of course, as we talked about, Tampa so far hasn't really had the kind of major hit that, say, Puerto Rico had with Hurricane Maria, but there are obviously a lot of vulnerability. So think about in Puerto Rico, I mean, they lost power, they lost water, a lot of people lost their homes and so forth, but also delayed and underwhelming disaster response, and so forth. And so this starts looking like a pattern, right? It starts, if we look at New Orleans, if we look at Puerto Rico and so forth, what we see is people who are more financially or economically impoverished, people who are in areas of high concentration of people of color tend to have to have more vulnerability and less response by the government. So this is just a chart. You can look at it at a later point. The PowerPoint should already be on, but it shows different kinds of ways that land use planning inequities tie in with climate change. Okay? And I just put that in there because I think some of you think more about those issues, and I just wanted to provide that. But we've talked about a number of those kinds of things about where development happens and the sort of vulnerability of that development. One thing is to sort of think about a community resilience strategy, what that might be. It might involve some community organizing and activism. It might involve planning and thinking through the implications. It might involve investment in green and blue infrastructure, which we're just about to talk about. And this is actually another type of green and blue infrastructure. So this is wetlands, but this is a community garden in the Parkland neighborhood in West Louisville, which is, illustrates addressing a different kind of vulnerability, which is a food desert vulnerability. And so think again, if climate change is going to increase cost of food, reduce access to food, and these are neighborhoods that already are food deserts, have a limited access to fresh and healthy food sources, or even sufficient food sources, obviously climate change is going to make those problems worse. And so that's another green and blue infrastructure issue. Litigation strategies. So litigation can be brought, for example, under human rights concepts and international agreements. There has been some of that. As I mentioned the other day, that's not been tremendously successful in the United States, in part because we generally don't think that we're bound by international commitments when that sort of doesn't mesh with what we or want to do domestically. We sort of think that's interfering with our domestic governance and so forth. So that has not been especially successful locally. It's been more successful in some other nations, the Netherlands, India, and so forth. And we'll see internationally if that has any effect. We've talked about federal environmental statutes, bringing lawsuits under federal environmental statutes. One that I just want to point out is a possibility that we haven't really talked about so far is, you remember under RCRA, right, there's a citizen suit that can be brought against a polluter for actions that pose a risk of substantial endangerment to human health or the environment. Okay? Well, there is a theory, a legal theory out there that with a lot of these waste facilities, they have not been designed, planned, or managed with climate change in mind. And so these pose a substantial risk of endangerment to the health of people who live nearby, who generally are low income and people of color. And so there might be lawsuits that could be brought to say, hey, before the disaster happens, right, because it's a risk of endangerment that is a basis for the lawsuit. So before the climate disaster happens, transportation, storage and disposal facility, treatment, storage and disposal facility, TSD facility, you need to take proactive steps. I don't know if it'll go anywhere, right? I mean, because, do they have an affirmative duty to protect against releases from when climate change is a factor? But since climate change is pretty much a known phenomenon now, maybe so. Okay, so that's the RCRA statute, citizen supervision. We talked about litigation under the public trust doctrine, nuisance law, and so forth. As I mentioned the other day, in terms of federal civil rights statutes, equal protection and due process, these have not fared especially well in court, but they've actually been moderately successful at getting changes in decisions, or changes in policies, or changes in the actions of private sector polluters or developers or so forth. So just think about this. If you are the US EPA, or you are a chemical company, or something of that sort, and you are being sued by an environmental justice group saying that your actions violate federal civil rights statutes, that if you're the government, that your decisions violate equal protection and due process because of their adverse impact on people on the basis of their race or ethnicity, right? Very difficult to prove, right? Because remember, once again, we talked about the need for proof of intent to discriminate, not just disparate impact, discriminatory intent, not just disparate impact. And so often what can be proven is the disparate impact, but not the discriminatory intent. Nonetheless, the lawsuit brings a lot of negative publicity. It sort of stirs up the status quo and can be successful. So for example, in California, this actually has led to these civil rights suits have never reached any judicial decision, but they have led to different industrial developers and land developers selling their land to the state to be turned into parks for park poor neighborhoods, for low-income and minority neighborhoods that don't have enough parks, and are saying, hey, instead of this industrial facility, we don't need another one. It's going to cause more cumulative impacts, environmental impacts. Their lawsuits actually never reached any judicial decision, but the fact that the lawsuit was brought, the developer says, hey, I'm out of here. If I can just sell the land to the state for what I paid for it, or for what I paid for it plus a little profit, and now it becomes a park, then it ends up being, it turns out it's kind of a win-win-win all the way around. Okay, so again, that's an example of litigation being used strategically, not to win in court, but to win the solution to the problem, the actual outcome. And then, of course, state and local laws can be a basis for litigation as well. We could focus as a strategy on statutory and regulatory reforms at federal, state, and local levels. Okay, the federal, state, and local levels. As we've talked about, at the moment, environmental justice strategies in terms of federal legislation or federal regulatory reform are probably not especially promising at the moment. But interestingly enough, in Florida, they are. Okay, so I think we talked about this before, but the relatively new governor of Florida has really made the environmental protection a priority. He's been particularly interested in addressing the red tides. Okay, red tides are created by algae bloom from nutrient runoff. We've talked about that before, right? Okay, they cause significant health risk and health harms, and so there may be some idea that maybe the Florida state government is interested in sort of rejuvenating or reinvigorating its environmental justice efforts in the state. And of course, then there's also the local government. And remember what we said about local governments in the Tampa Bay area? There are a whole lot of them, right? We're talking about a large metropolitan area with lots of different cities and counties. Okay, so that when we think about that as a strategy, that's obviously a very multi-pronged effect. You got to sort of work with lots of different governments. We've talked about adaptation as a strategy. We're about to talk about green and blue infrastructure, and then climate disaster preparedness and community resilience. We've just been highlighting. Okay, so last sort of thing is to talk about sort of beyond the law. So community organizing, developing a sort of political or social movement around environmental justice, utilizing networks with other local groups and with other environmental justice groups nationally. So sort of national networks and very local networks, and political activism. All of these are going to be very important to integrate your legal strategies with the fact that, in the end, you're more likely to see improved outcomes if you are organized and politically active. How you frame the issues is going to be important. We talked about framing at the very beginning of problem 3. We've talked about multi-participant collaboration quite a lot, and just to identify that that's a key strategy here. There are a lot of different players, a lot of different stakeholders in these issues, and what are some of the ways that you might make sure that you are included at the table when that's happening. Okay, so that's one thing, is your group needs to be included, but secondly, could you perhaps try to create some of these collaborations? So reach out and get stakeholders involved, right? Remember, the Mono Lake Committee did exactly that, and that was a key element to resolving that issue. More research and study. And then finally, I just want to remind you that a key part of the lawyering here for your environmental justice group includes cultural competence. It includes being aware of your client and the communities that you're representing, the people you're working with, being empathetic to their situation, listening, checking your assumptions and stereotypes. Okay, and with that, by the way, I want to just sort of suggest that you think about language and being more precise in your language. So one of the things that, if you're referring to a neighborhood and so forth, what about its conditions are difficult or problematic, right? Instead of just saying, this is a rundown neighborhood, that's very pejorative, right? That's very narrow and sort of, boxes that neighborhood in. But what about it? Is it that has a high number of vacant and abandoned properties? That's much more precise, and that's much more what lawyers are expected to do. Be precise in that way. Don't make these sort of broad statements that have kind of like a lot of baggage or loaded meaning to them and so forth. Poor. Okay, poor is a word that sometimes gets a little bit of pushback. Okay, because you can be poor in different kinds of ways. Okay, there are despite my enthusiasm, there are a number of athletic activities in which I am poor. Okay, but I would probably not. I'm not wealthy by any sense of the imagination, but I would not consider myself poor from a financial standpoint, and so forth. This law school is poor financially, right? But we have awesome students, and so in terms of the quality of students and the quality of teaching and learning here, we're quite impressive. Okay, so you see what I'm saying? You just want to sort of be more precise in your language, because then that gets at people's problems, and then you want to sort of think about how what you're doing empowers the people you're working with. Okay, empowers them. So don't be the lawyer who takes over the problem from them and decides what the community needs. Right? Instead, listen to the community and help them build their own power. Okay? So questions? Right. So, get on here. And now we're going to turn to Rena infrastructure, and this is kind of a interesting and fun area because now we're really thinking more in terms of solutions, and green and blue infrastructure turns out to be really pretty important in dealing with some of the kinds of environmental issues that we've been asked to address here in the Tampa Bay area. So when we talk about green and blue infrastructure, what are we talking about? Well, our starting point is scientists and academics refer to ecosystems. We've talked a lot about that, you know, the way that nature sort of organizes in systems. And so, you know, green and blue infrastructure is part of ecosystems, but more specifically, it's about the services that ecosystems provide to society, people, the economy. Okay, and these are economically valuable services. The sort of estimate of the value of all ecosystem services globally is several times the gross domestic product of all nations together. So in other words, you know, all of our economic activity worldwide is only a fraction of the value of that the ecosystem services provide to our economy. So basically, think about it as the capital, the natural capital on which you know, our lives depend, our society depends, our communities depend, and our economy depends. And so if, for example, we lose the pollinators, we lose the bees and the other pollinators, all of a sudden we have lost a big chunk of our food supply. Okay, there's just there's no good substitute out there. Okay, if we lose our forest, okay, we lose some critical sort of atmosphere regulating kinds of things, resources that there's just not good substitutes for. When we start getting down more to the local level, the urban level, and also talking about policy. So policymakers, planners, people like that tend to prefer the term green and blue infrastructure because it gets at, first of all, the idea that this is infrastructure in our local communities, okay? And secondly, that it's green and blue, that we're talking about things that are living or things that are aquatic, okay, water. So living things or water things. And that's sort of the gist of it. So ecosystem services tends to be just, very academic, right? Very science oriented. Natural capital is things like businesses like to use that, economists like to use that. But from a policy standpoint, green and blue infrastructure is more the term we use. So what are we talking about? Well, here's a list of various categories. You can come up with different ways of putting these together. There's no right answer here. But we're talking about trees, forests, tree canopy, that kind of thing. We're talking about vegetation, native plants, flowers, etc. We're talking about parks, open space, recreation areas, greenways, green belts, corridors, basically land that has certain natural features, but maybe actually not just passively enjoyed for, oh, it's beautiful, or, oh, I'm going to go out and, look at the trees and the grasses and so forth, but maybe actively used as recreation. So, includes soccer fields and so forth. Wildlife habitat. Well, these are also wildlife habitat, but we want to just sort of call out specifically wildlife habitat. Maybe, there's some things that don't fit into any of this. Well-functioning watersheds, waters, riparian lands, and wetlands. Okay, so when we talk about waters, we're including rivers, streams, creeks, lakes, etc. Okay, so basically, the waters and the lands connected with the waters, are they well-functioning? includes, and wetlands are a very important part of this, right? So are riparian lands and so forth. Well-functioning coastal lands and waters. So this includes the sand dunes and the seagrasses and so on and so forth that stabilize them, and what we're looking at is, do we have coastal zones that are doing what coastal zones are supposed to do? Coastal zones are supposed to buffer the terrestrial from the marine, buffer the land from the ocean. The ocean has a tremendous amount of force, right? You just think about those waves over and over again. Think about storms, hurricanes, etc. Winds off of the ocean. It's a tremendous amount of force from the ocean, and the coastal zones buffer the land from all that. What we call biotic stormwater controls, as well as green roofs. So let me start with the biotic stormwater controls. We're talking about things like rain gardens, bioswales, things where we maybe retention or detention basins, like over here in the Oval, right? Right around you go driving around from the law school and the Thinker and so forth. Okay, all that grass, that big oval shape of grass, underneath that, and it tells you not to walk on it, right? Well, underneath that is a big detention basin where all the runoff from this part of campus ends up, okay? So that's a biotic stormwater control. And then green roofs, okay? So green roofs are, I put them in this category because they serve some biotic stormwater control functions, but they also are really important for urban heat management, so reducing heat, and so that those go together. Agricultural lands and soils, urban and community gardens, basically ways that places and systems in which we grow things, so that includes not just the lands themselves, but the soils. Soil, by the way, is a living organism. Okay, that's something that sometimes people don't think about. It's not just dirt, okay? It's actually, soil is a living organism, and I think I mentioned a few class sessions ago, when it's gone, it's a serious problem. Different mechanisms to stabilize the soils and prevent erosion and so forth. The benefits of green and blue infrastructure are tremendous. Both of the articles identify a lot of different benefits. They improve air quality, filter out pollutants, and so on and so forth. They improve water quality, filter out pollutants from water, and so forth. They control or manage stormwater runoff. They control and manage floods. So when we're talking about riparian lands and well-functioning watersheds, that includes floodplains. We develop all our floodplains, we've now created a major problem. Well, first of all, our land development is going to flood, but secondly, we no longer have nature holding those floodwaters and then slowly releasing them. Moderating temperatures. So we know, you had the reading where trees in urban communities and urban environments reduce the heat. Food sources and addressing food deserts and so forth. Soil richness and stabilization, biodiversity. There are lots and lots and lots of studies that show various types of green and blue infrastructure improve physical health in a whole number of ways, and a really internationally known study is happening here at the University of Louisville. The Green Hearts Project is looking at trying to demonstrate actual impacts of trees on heart health and cardiovascular health and so forth. We also know from lots and lots of studies that green and blue infrastructure improves mental and emotional health. Okay, right? And I mean, just think about it, right? How much happier we were when we were having class outside than it being here in this sort of windowless, cramped, overly hot room, right? I mean, no, I mean, think about it, right? And so, for example, hospitals, tremendous improvements in health just by having windows that people can see trees or grass or that kind of thing. Safety, aesthetics, property values, more green and blue infrastructure, higher the property values, green jobs, and resilience to climate change and disaster. All of these things moderate or manage the impacts of climate change and other kinds of disasters. From the standpoint of our problem, we are concerned particularly with the fact that there are tremendous disparities in green and blue infrastructure. That across almost all types of green and blue infrastructure, the low-income communities and communities of color have less. I mean, they have less amount, so the distribution is less. They have less access to green and blue infrastructure, less benefits. So not only less in their neighborhood, but being able to get to it, to access it due to transportation and other sorts of things, being able to benefit from the green and blue infrastructure considerably less. The quality, so when there is, the quality is generally poor. There have been a lot of studies, for example, on parks and park maintenance and park conditions, and you won't be surprised that if it's in a low-income neighborhood of color, it is more likely to be poorer, more poorly maintained, right? Less less investment, less upkeep, and so forth. Participation and inclusion in decision making over green and blue infrastructure. And then finally, issues related to green gentrification and displacement. We've talked about that before, but I want to kind of circle back around to it. What we see in lots and lots of different examples around the country is that the typical pattern is you have low-income neighborhoods of color that don't have enough parks, or they don't have a proportionate number of parks, trees, their waterways are polluted, they may be paved with concrete or whatever, they don't have wetlands, etc. So, they're food deserts, all these kinds of things. What happens, the government comes in, invests a lot in adding parks, planting trees, restoring the waterways, making this sort of whole nice riparian walking path with lots of vegetation and restoration of the waterway and so forth, make it more natural, etc. Putting in rain gardens, all that kind of stuff. And it could be any of that kind of stuff. But they engage in these green and blue infrastructure projects. And then what happens? They become targets for developers who are going to redevelop the area and turn it into fancy schmancy housing and fancy schmancy restaurants and coffee houses and other kinds of retail establishments, hotels, etc. And so the property values go up, the rents go up, the people who have been living there without the green and blue infrastructure can no longer afford to live there. They are displaced, and so what you have is just a replication of other parts of town that have historically had, lots of green and blue infrastructure and, higher end or higher cost land uses and so forth. And so, and generally what happens is one of two things happen. One is the people who were living there, as they're displaced, they either move to other neighborhoods that have environmental harms, toxic facilities, and inadequate green and blue infrastructure, or in some cases, if they're economically marginal enough, they become homeless, right? And then this becomes a whole thing because now they're sleeping in the parks that have just been added, and then there are all sorts of law enforcement efforts to sort of move them on or arrest them or hassle them or whatever, and so it becomes this whole sort of vicious cycle. Why are there these disparities? There are actually, this is overly simplified, but I just want to point out sort of three things that are going on here, three kind of explanations. In my view, people tend to gravitate towards one explanation, but in my view, you can find elements of all three explanations in almost any example. We can think systemically about structural inequality and structural racism and so forth, xenophobia and so forth, the kind of ways in which systems work structurally to sort of embed and reinforce inequality. Okay? So that's one thing. And so when you sort of look at all of this together, right? So green gentrification is an example of how you've got these sort of intersecting forces, and it sort of reiterates that. So another possible explanation that we see a lot of is in terms of government policies and the actions of particular participants in the process is underinvestment and disinvestment in low-income communities of color. So that's another thing that's going on here. This is the kind of thing that this kind of explanation is the one that might be more susceptible to or more responsive to things like civil rights lawsuits or environmental lawsuits, challenging, say, for example, bringing a NEPA challenge to a decision, saying, hey, you haven't considered the impact of your action on this neighborhood adequately, etc. Because this is kind of what the law tends to focus on. Law tends to focus on bad or wrong actions, right? The wrong wrong motivation, the wrong standards, the wrong decision, the wrong process, the failure to follow the rules, etc. Right? And the law is not nearly as effective at transformation of entire systems, right? So does that kind of resonate with things that you've encountered before? And then a third type of systemic approach is to think about market dynamics, okay? And to think about that if you have communities that have fewer resources, they tend to locate in areas that offer less infrastructure, and at the same time, when infrastructure comes, is invested in that neighborhood, that community, or whatever, then it tends to affect things like property values and cost of things and rent and so forth. And then you have these sort of market dynamics where then they're looking for places that they can afford. And so so we see that kind of dynamic as well. Okay? So what are some solutions? Well, I've given some examples of some specific kinds of things. This is not at all exhaustive, but I just want to sort of call your attention to some specific things that could be something you might want to consider for your client. One is just targeted funding for green and blue infrastructure projects in the neighborhoods that you're working with. Okay, so thinking about investing in parks, investing in tree planting, investing in stream restoration activities, and so forth. And targeting that. So think here locally, right? Where are we putting, for example, the rain gardens? Are they going in the East End? Are they going in the Highlands? Or are they going in West Louisville? Right? I mean, that's a question that is basically calls for groups and advocates working with groups, including their lawyers, to think about pushing for the funding in the projects to be focused on where there's greatest need and where the community has identified needs. So that's not just what happens, but also the process, the how, the participation, the inclusion, the idea that the community has some input or some voice. Okay? Next, tree canopy ordinances. Okay? So one of the sort of things that a number of local governments have done is adopted ordinances that prohibit property owners or developers from cutting down trees without replacing them. Okay? So sometimes it's just entirely new development, so it's meant to try to disincentivize the developer coming in with a bulldozer and just wiping out all the trees, and then you have a new residential subdivision that, with a bunch of treeless houses, maybe down the road they'll eventually have some trees, but that doesn't really do much for your tree canopy right now. And some of them extend not only to new developers, new development, but they extend to all property owners. Okay? And so that's basically not only does it shape new development, but it ends up shaping existing trees. It basically tries to protect existing trees. So those are some things. Very minimal sort of tree canopy ordinance says, well, you can't harm or damage street trees, for example, which are usually in public rights of way, but oftentimes landowners have some effect on them. So there are different kinds of tree canopy ordinances. Another sort of thing is either through ordinances, regulations, or permit conditions. Okay, so ordinances, regulations, or permit conditions imposing performance standards. So a performance standard, for example, might be any new development has to have zero net runoff, zero net stormwater runoff. So that means that there can't be any more stormwater running off from the site than existed before the property was developed. What does that mean? It means practically that the developer has to include green and blue infrastructure that retains the stormwater on site. It doesn't mandate that, but that's the effect, right? The effect is that they have to maintain it on site. It's probably going to be mixed, probably some gray, some green, but basically the performance standard says, we don't really care which mechanisms the developer uses. That's really up to them. What we care is the effect. Is there runoff? Is there more runoff happening after the property's been developed or not? And if we can keep it to net zero, then we don't have any more runoff happening after the development. Another type of solution is mitigation measures and permit conditions that get imposed on somebody that needs a permit, or some regulated party that is required to mitigate the adverse harms. And so green and blue infrastructure can be a very valuable mitigation measure or permit condition, whether it's local, state, or federal permits. Okay, so this really can be across the board, local, federal, or state permits. And so as an advocate for the neighborhoods and communities that you're advocating for, you will probably want to push, right? We've talked about a whole variety of different kinds of permits There are others out there. I mean, the point is not really this permit versus that permit, but the idea is a systematic approach to always pushing for permittees or parties that are required to mitigate to put in green and blue infrastructure where that's appropriate for the impact that their project's going to have or their action's going to have. Environmental impact analysis, okay? So the EIS kind of analysis, looking at the impacts of federal agency actions on green and blue infrastructure in these neighborhoods, and requiring that very specifically that the federal agency that's doing the EIS pay attention to your communities. So, for example, if they're going to put in a new freeway, or they're going to put in, a new veterans VA hospital. Okay, so it's Veterans Day, right? The VA hospital. Okay. To what extent is that taking away from or contributing to the green and blue infrastructure in a low-income community of color? Wetlands conservation and restoration, we talked about 404, and then we also talked a little bit about state programs as well, but obviously, wetlands are an important part of green and blue infrastructure, and what we know is that generally we see more deterioration and loss in the urban areas, and the mitigation, the replacement is often in some rural area that's either underpopulated, I mean, it's not heavily populated, or is higher income, okay? And so, what kind of replacement, what kind of mitigation, what kind of restoration is happening in the neighborhoods that you're working with. And then finally, gentrification control policies. This is tricky. But basically what you're looking for is when green and blue infrastructure projects happen, when there's investment in green and blue infrastructure in the communities you represent, what kind of accompanying policies help to keep the neighborhood affordable and help discourage displacement of existing residents, okay? So one thing is, one sort of approach has to do with more housing and housing affordability, okay? And the other approach has to do with more partnering with community, community-based development. So local businesses that are owned by and operated by people in the neighborhood, okay? So in other words, instead of, once the new park comes in and so forth, instead of it being a Hilton that goes next door, is it possible that it could be, say, for example, a Cuban bakery or something of that sort. So that's sort of the gist. And then finally, I just want to point out that there are some other ways of thinking through solutions. I mean, I just give you some very concrete examples, but your reading done has 4 categories: promote acceptance through quantification models and regulatory reform. Secondly, increase public funding and incentives for green and blue infrastructure projects. Third is develop legal strategies that facilitate green and blue infrastructure solutions. And fourth is raise awareness by policymakers and the public. As you can see, those are really broad categories, very, very aspirational. The article that Jim Salzman and several others and I wrote, that was your other reading, sort of talks about 2 things that need to happen. One is we need better research. So that was sort of the point of the article, was to assess what we know and what we don't know. But the other thing is then that research needs to feed legal policy and governance reforms. And so our number one category, our first category that we talked about, was incorporating equitable principles into decision making. So when we're doing planning and policy making on green and blue infrastructure projects, to what extent are we considering social equity or racial justice or that kind of thing, right? And so that's that's really sort of more about sort of decision-making standards. Secondly, the second category has to do with payments. So paying for the benefits of green and blue infrastructure or investing in green and blue infrastructure. So that's public funding, private payments. So for example, if there are a bunch of fisheries that are benefiting from a wetland in a neighborhood that you're working with, that you're representing, is there some sort of way to facilitate payments in order to protect that wetland, because it benefits both the neighborhood and the fishing industry? And then also issues related to liability, compliance, and insurance. And we talked about those issues as well just a little bit ago. And then finally, our third category was governance generally. And so that talks about thinking more in terms of ecosystem scale. So instead of just thinking, here are our counties in the Tampa Bay area and here are our separate cities, could we have some sort of cross-jurisdictional cooperation that looks at sort of the scales of, say, for example, tree canopy or that kind of thing. Improving participation and inclusion in the process. Developing regulatory support, so that's some of the things like the tree canopy ordinances and the performance standards and the permit conditions. Just explicitly including ecosystem services or green and blue infrastructure as goals, okay? So, and that has become more true now. So we see that more. In fact, April sent me some stuff that she has come across recently where this is being more of a, locally is being sort of highlighted as a goal. But we also talk about, the article talks a little bit about expressly dealing with trade-offs. Accounting, so thinking through how we actually measure the benefits of green and blue infrastructure and keeping track of that. So again, if we know, for example, that trees provide certain health benefits, and we have communities that have serious health problems, serious health disparities, more health problems in these neighborhoods in comparison to others, could we, for example, say, well, if we plant X number of trees, we will get Y health benefits in this neighborhood that has some serious health problems. And that's exactly what the research that's being done here at U of L is focused on. And then finally, adaptive management. Can we think about the fact, say, for example, that if we're going to do some wetland restoration or stream restoration, we need to take into account that we can't just put it back the way it was, right? We can't put it back the old way because conditions have changed, and we have to think about climate change. We have to think about how this is going to change over time. All right, so I know that's a whole bunch of stuff about green and blue infrastructure, but it's designed to kind of give you a big picture overview. Okay, so what are you going to do with this? Just looking at this as a set of possible solutions that are aimed at addressing the environmental disparities and injustices in the neighborhoods that you're working with, right? So that's the idea behind this. There's not like a definitive, you must say the following 17 things, right? You want to think through some strategies. What would make sense? What would work? And you can't do everything, right? I mean, if your strategy really turns out to be, my client must pursue the following 500 different courses of action, that's overwhelming, right? I mean, that's too much. But this gives you some things to think about and work with, and so forth. Okay, questions? questions? Okay, good. All right, so on Wednesday, we will have our last class meeting. We will have ice cream, and we will also have, oh, you missed that earlier. And we will and we will talk about writing the paper, and as well as sort of how we would go about thinking through solutions to problem 3, which is of course what you're ultimately going to be doing. So, all right. We'll see everybody again. You should have all the PowerPoints now.